People have a lot of problems defending capitalism on the affirmative versus critiques when the negative argues about sustainability. Sustainability arguments are essentially a terminal uniqueness claim that since the capitalist economy can't be maintained in its present form, it's better to collapse it now than at some point in the future. The problem with most affirmatives in these arguments is that they're failing to identify a distinction between what the negative is saying. There's basically two different forms of sustainability arguments. First are material or physical limits. These are arguments like peak oil or global warming puts a cap on the amount of economic growth that we can have. In the case of peak oil, once oil runs out, since oil drives such a huge part of our economy, economic growth would grind to a halt. In the case of global warming, actual economic activity, consumption, produces the problem, carbon emissions, that will then eventually kill us all. Conceptual or theoretical problems are distinct from material or physical problems. These argue that there's a problem within the theory of capitalism, not the practice. An example would be the idea of overproduction and wages and how it creates a crisis of consumption. Capitalists, people who own the means of production, want to make money. In order to do that, they want to sell as much of their product as they can, and they want to pay their workers who make the product as little as possible. Both selling more and reducing wages increase profits. The problem of overproduction happens when all capitalists in a market engage in the same behavior. Eventually, there will be too many goods and not enough people with money because wages have been reduced to purchase those goods. This is what produces a crisis of overproduction. Classic examples of this are things like bubbles. The real estate or tech.com bubbles are examples of where inflated prices couldn't be maintained indefinitely because there was no purchasing power in order to have enough demand. Conceptual and theoretical problems are different from material problems in that most of the answers to material problems reassert the fundamental logic of capitalism. Let's take a look. Answering material warrants make arguments like the following. Market substitution effects will fix the problem. So if we start to run out of copper and electrical wiring, we can switch to a different product that may be more expensive and not cost competitive right now, but with increased demand and increased scarcity of copper, become competitive. In the early 1980s, cornucopian economist Julian Simon made a bet with Paul Ehrlich about the price of 10 commodities and whether or not it would increase or decrease over time as demand increased, and allegedly so did scarcity. Ehrlich lost all of the bets. Innovation and competition are the idea that in a capitalist economy, people will compete with one another in order to make money, and that competition drives innovation. So whereas current cars may emit a lot of carbon, if there is a demand for a clean environment, people will compete to find the best way to produce new electric cars that don't release carbon emissions. The environmental Kuznets curve, or EKC, says that as a country develops, people get more money, more free time. They care about things that aren't their immediate physical needs like food and shelter, and that causes them to want to protect the environment. That means that in order to protect the environment, we first have to build a constituency that demands a cleaner environment through economic growth and development. Now, all three of these arguments rely on market logic. The substitution effect assumes products like copper and other metals compete with one another, and that you can just make a choice to pick a different product when faced with a price you don't like. Innovation presumes that a capitalist economy in which people have to compete with one another is the economy most likely to promote new innovation and new technologies that can fix environmental problems. The Kuznets curve assumes that there is a correlation between economic development and market choice, which causes people to opt for a cleaner environment. All of these arguments are a response to physical limits, but don't defend the fundamental theories of capitalism that they rely upon. When answering theoretical warrants, therefore, reading evidence like this isn't very helpful because it doesn't answer the negative's argument that the logic that evidence is based on is flawed. So how do you answer theoretical warrants? Well, first you need to question the impact. I frequently see debates where the negative says structures of the capitalist economy produce a boom-bust cycle and a recession every 10 years. Rarely does the affirmative point out that those recessions are oftentimes things like the '08 financial collapse, which, while bad, did not trigger nuclear war or cause a transition away from capitalism. The system generally recovers from crisis. You also want to argue that the case fixes the economy. If you read the High Skilled Immigration Act, for example, you want to say that new immigrant entrepreneurs will start companies and raise wages, which would eliminate a crisis of overproduction. You want to read defenses of market epistemology. So you don't just want to read evidence that says the market is good. You want to read evidence that says how we know the market is good. So empirics are kind of the most obvious. You could look at the track record of the market versus other systems. You could also have more theoretical warrants, i.e. in the context of overproduction, you could read evidence about why business people wouldn't make those decisions in order to change wages and increase production.